Welcome to the Mystic and Skeptic. Our guest is Mira Z. Amiras. She was raised by her mother's account of the Inquisition and Holocaust and her father's tales of the Hebrew alphabet letters and their role in the creation of the universe. She's a professor emerita at Comparative Religion and Middle East Studies at San Jose State University. She received a PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and she's the author of Development and Disenchantment in Rural Tunisia, writer and director of the award-winning animated movie The Day Before Creation. She's also the author of the book Malka's Notebook, which is fascinating and we'll be discussing today on our show. Welcome, Ms. Mira.
Thank you so much.
So tell us about your journey. I know you live in San Francisco, but how did you decide to study anthropology and world religions in your journey, and what was your experience being a descendant of a Holocaust survivor?
So my father used to give me books. I think from Malka's Notebook that becomes pretty obvious. And when I was in about 6th grade, he gave me a book of archaeology. And I decided that that would be the greatest thing in the world, to become an archaeologist, except for one thing, that he also brought me to bookstores, and he brought me to City Lights, which is Lawrence Ferlinghetti's bookstore and publishing house in those days of beat poetry. So I decided I wanted to be a beat poet. So it was archaeology, anthropology, or poetry, and the whole beatnik thing. And it turned out, I didn't know it then, but you could do both. and I think that influenced me. I became an anthropologist, and I was also obsessed with the beat movement and the poetry of that era.
So you've been doing other poetry before this book, and what were you teaching when you were a professor in California?
So at first I was in the anthropology department at San Jose State University, and I created a Middle East Studies program. And it turned out that the social science, the School of Social Science was not going to approve it. And so I moved over to the humanities and the humanities department and College of Humanities and the Arts and religious studies, because they were happy to have a Middle East Studies program. So it was a shock going from anthropology to religious studies, but it turned out to be a very good fit.
And did you have a traditional religious education? Were you already fluent in Hebrew with your anthropology? And did you study other languages as you were developing the Middle East studies?
When I was a kid, I went to a school in LA called Hillel Hebrew Academy. It was half a day Hebrew in the morning and half a day English in the afternoon. And in the morning, all the language and all the letters were alive, and they went from right to left, and they all had personalities, and they had prayers, and they had a whole universe. And in the afternoon, everything was in English, and it was just consonants and vowels. And so I think I really appreciated the difference between the two. So I grew up with those two languages. I've never become fluent in anything, but I went to study in Israel when I was 18. I think it was 18, and instead of final exams at the end of the year, there was a war. That was the 67 war, the 6-day war. And at the end of that war, and after I returned home, I decided that my education had been entirely Jewish, and that I needed to discover the other side, the total opposite end of things, which I thought was the opposite end of things. And I started studying Arabic and Islam and the Arab world to kind of put my experience of that 6-day war, just 6 days, into perspective, since I had had an entirely Zionist education and I needed to know the region and the peoples of the region. So then I began balancing those two and discovering how much they had in common as opposed to what they had in warfare. Apart from that, I also lived in Belgium for a few years, and so I learned French as well. So, and in North Africa, those languages get all mixed up. So there's a combination of French and Arabic, local dialects of Arabic that become distinctly North African.
And I want to know more about your book about Tunisia. Do you have relatives from there? Because we had a guest who, his whole family were crypto Jews who fled persecution in Mexico and ended up in Tunisia. And then he moved to, I think he was born in Paris and then he ended up in Israel. What was the connection with North Africa in the development of that book?
In the development of that book, I would say I wanted to do this research originally in Algeria. And one of my advisors at University of California, Berkeley said, you will never be able to do this in Algeria. It's just too fraught certainly at that time. He said, Ahla wa sahla, come to Tunisia. And so I did, and Tunisia was this incredibly welcoming experience from top to bottom, from the archives to personal experiences. Every door opened and people were the most welcoming, at every level of society, and from officials to the peasantry, to women's homes, to men's meetings at the unions. And so Tunisia was an absolutely ideal place to do research. And so this was starting, 40 years ago, and I'm still close to then, and their children and their grandchildren. The grandchild of the woman I was closest to in Tunisia 40 years ago was living at my house during COVID and is now a grad student at a university here. And so I've maintained those relationships all this time.
And if you don't mind me asking, how many Jews are left in North Africa? Is there still Jews in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, or have they all moved away due to persecution and displacement?
There are still Jews in Tunisia, and there's still Jews in Morocco. And not only that, a number of years ago, there was the opening of the Jewish Museum in Morocco. And I can't remember if that was in Fez or Casa, but in Fez, there's a Jewish quarter that gets many visitors and is maintained specifically to visit the old Jewish quarter and the cemetery especially. And it's visited not just by Jews, but there are pilgrimages in Morocco and in Tunisia, from Israel, from France, from Canada, during around Pesach time, the pilgrimages to the graves of the tzaddikim. In fact, one year when I was in Morocco, one springtime, Hillary Clinton was taking her daughter to ride camels in the South. And I was told, you see, she's a Jew because she came at Pesach to the south of the country, so she must be Jewish. And there was nothing I could say, or that I didn't try very hard, but nothing I could say to convince anybody in Morocco that she wasn't a Jewish pilgrim coming to see her ancestors. That's how strong the pilgrimage season is for Jews returning to North Africa.
So I know she's married to a Jewish gentleman, the daughter of Hillary Clinton, Chelsea. And for people who are not familiar with these terms, so Pesach is Passover, which we're celebrating this week, and then the Tzaddikim is the righteous ones, or the sages, the people who are saintly in Jewish tradition. So let's moving on to your book, which the animated film is based on. This is I guess a review from someone that is part of the book and in the afterword. J.B. Bristol in 2022 said the following: Malka's notebook is also the story of the exile of the Shekhinah. At first, she's locked away, hidden inside a patriarchal library, the girl at the window, exiled from her mother, from herself, and from the world. But she has the courage to break free and rediscover the Torah and the world on her own terms. I'm grateful to Mira for having invented Malka, who is above all things a reader like you. Would you say that this is an autobiographical book, and how much of your own experience is within the pages of this publication?
There's not much that isn't me. And as you know, it's an illustrated book, so there are illustrations on every page, and in part that follow the movie. But the illustrations that show Malka are showing my life, including she wears my clothes, she wears my mother's amulets. Her father is my father, and yet. I'm not, she's not a fictional character, but she's not living in the world either. And yes, I think Josh is correct that she has a life that is similar to the Shekhinah, locked away and disconnected from the world until she chooses to step out and find the world and try to piece it back together.
And also that term in Western Christian circles, they say Shekinah or Shekinah. The way that I've heard it is Shekinah is God's presence, or almost like the Holy Spirit, but it has a feminine component in Jewish mysticism. So tell us what inspired the book, because this is complex stuff that unless you have a Jewish education, it might be hard to navigate. So we start with the Spirit of God hovering over the waters in the beginning verse of the book of Genesis. And where do you go from there in the book?
Well, my book starts earlier than that. That is, so you started with the hovering over Merachefet al Pnei Hamayim, but this book starts with the very first words. We don't even get that far. In fact, in the whole book, we don't get that far. It starts with the beginning, that literally the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim et. In the beginning, God created, and then there's this word, et, which isn't translated anywhere. And it doesn't appear anywhere. And the question was, you have this little girl, and her father's trying to teach her Torah, and she gets stuck on the fourth word. So she doesn't get to anything else that happens. And she falls in right there. And then her journey takes place, Malka's journey takes place inside those two letters. What could that mean? And is it even et? Maybe it's at, which means you, which makes everything that happens after that feminine. Maybe it's ot, which means letter. And eventually she discovers that aleph is the first letter of the alphabet, and taf is the very last letter of the alphabet, which means Bereshit bara Elohim et means in the beginning, God created, or God was created, but God created the whole alphabet. That is, in the beginning was this word, and the word is et. And that tells you that everything that's created is created through the letters. And that is by a recombination, like DNA recombining genes. It's the recombination of these letters that make everything and make the stories that we have. And so that's how the book starts, with her trying to figure out this et. And the movie as well. It's what is this et, and where do we go from there?
And it's a profound theological perspective, because my debate with a lot of theologians from other Western traditions is that they're all models. Like the way we interpret the scripture is a model. Like, so if you pick one thing to emphasize over another, you build metaphorical language and structures. So in comparison to the Christian tradition, they take the passage from Isaiah where it says, I am the beginning and I'm the end. And then they apply it to Jesus and they say that he's the Alpha and the Omega. So there's no creation of Et or Aleph and Tav. Now you have Aleph and Tav being God, and God revealed through Jesus. So I've seen in the progressive translations of the Torah, it says that it's not in the beginning God created, but when God began to create. So it gives you a space where there was stuff before, and maybe there was other worlds or other universes that happened before, and it expands the interpretation of the first verses of the Torah. Was this something that you realized yourself as you were studying ancient religions, or is this something that you heard from a medieval rabbi or from the Talmud in relation to those first letters? And I know in the mystical tradition, every letter has some type of divine essence. Was that where that came from?
Well, about 10 years ago, I started studying Zohar. And that is Daniel Matt, who retranslated the Pritzker edition of Zohar. To celebrate that, he created a series of studies in Zohar in different locations all around this area, around San Francisco Bay Area. And we were asked at the beginning, what is it that brought you to Zohar? And I said, what brought me to Zohar is I'm still trying to figure out et, this Aleph and Tav, and I had still not come upon any explanation that would, I mean, it's a grammatical construct. You know, any Hebrew teacher will say, well, all it does is it introduces a direct object, but it introduces every important direct object. People don't care about such things, but I was obsessed with this et, and it turned out that the Zohar has written a huge amount on the et. And so I was very gratified. I didn't know that, but anyway, I continued to study Zohar because of this obsession with the et. So in the book, Malka's obsession with et, and that et opens this door for her, definitely mirrors my experience, although she started much younger than I did.
And for those not familiar with the Zohar, it's a mystical work, I believe, from the 13th century, yeah. And it was written by Joseph Caro in Spain. And some people say it's a compilation of more ancient mystical works from Jewish tradition. Other people say that it was developed by him or revealed by him, or that it was originally from another rabbi in the 2nd century, and it was finally passed down to him and he put it together. So, but it's the foundation of modern Kabbalah, and Daniel Matt is one of the founders of the Kabbalah Center, and there are many organizations throughout the world. So when you look at the book keeps going into Bereshit bara Elohim et. Is that the same passage? Yeah, because it's the beginning it got created et. And then you break down each letter, and also the word Elohim later on. When you study the word for God or gods, is that where you go into the other Semitic religions of Canaan, where there was the great god El, and then you try to show the connection between Judaism and the Canaanite religion? or what are you trying to do with that part of the story?
That might be the most controversial part of the book, actually. The idea, God forbid, excuse me, that the Jewish tradition is coming out of another tradition. But all traditions come out of another tradition, and eventually they all go back to Sumer and Mesopotamia, and a little bit from Egypt, much less so, I believe. But our ideas are coming from other ideas, previous ideas, and the letters, the Hebrew letters that we have today are coming from earlier Hebrew letters or Proto-Hebraic letters, and they're going back to these Canaanite letters and Egyptian letters. The letter Bet, for example, is shaped like a courtyard. And if you look at the hieroglyphics, it actually is a courtyard that represents the house. And what is the letter Bet? But the letter that Bet means Beit, it means house, or in Arabic, it means room. And it's shaped, the shape of the Bet is exactly like a room. So I got interested in the origin of the letters themselves, and not just with Hebrew, but also with North African indigenous languages, that there was a language that looked like art, and that art was something that women put on their own bodies, that they would use tattoos or henna, and they'd create these designs, or they'd weave them into their carpets and put them in their pottery. And it turned out that those two were an ancient language. They didn't even remember that it was a language. So I'm interested in the letters as symbols and going back as far as we can go.
You mentioned your grandfather being an atheist. Do you feel that religious folks or those interested in mysticism have to respond to their questions and their concerns, especially when you look into anthropology and sociology, how things develop versus thinking of everything just coming straight from God and dictated to Moses? By doing musings of the letters, you're also exploring different ways you can look at the tradition without dismissing it and seeing how rich it could be just coming from different sources.
My grandfather loved the language too, and I mean, he was raised also with Turkish and Ladino. I mean, he was Sephardic, so this Judeo-Spanish that he was raised with was written in Hebrew letters, and he was a factory worker, a communist in the early days of factory workers trying to organize in the unions. And God didn't help at all. And his skepticism did help. His atheism, his belief in humanity, that it was going to take humans organizing, that was the cornerstone of his existence. It was the most important thing in his life. But he did have this mystical bent, and I think for him it came out of music. He played oud, and he had a little group of the old men who played oud together, and the women would play their castanets and their zills. And I think the mystical part of his existence came out of the harmony of their voices and the harmony of the music itself. I don't think mysticism has to come out of some intellectual pursuit, but the joining together in harmony, I think that's what it was for him.
In page 92, you mentioned the four sages that went to paradise. I find that passage very intriguing because it shows how when people experience the divine, they all have different ways to process it. So you have Ben Asai, Ben Zoma, Elijah Ben Abuya, and Rabbi Akiva, and one goes crazy, one dies, one becomes a heretic, and the other guy comes out enlightened from the experience. What do you learn from that passage in the Talmud in relation to our human individual experience of God and of the heavenly realms as described in that.
That story, which is only a few lines long, of their journey and what happens to each of the sages, that journey I see as handing us a tool, handing us a methodology. And when I teach, I tend to call it the Pardes model. That is the model, the letters. So it's back to the letters, that each of those rabbis represents one of the letters of the word Pardes, which means paradise, or the orchard, with a capital O of orchard. And if you start with the Pardes with the letter P, it stands for the word pshat, which is concrete, simple. This is a way of experiencing the world exactly as it is. The physical world, it is what it is. There's nothing else. It's very fundamentalist approach of taking things level. I see it as the first level of consciousness. And then each of these rabbis experiences the world from a different perspective. And if you continue to the last one, Rabbi Akiva, he is the letter S, Sod, which stands for the hidden dimension, the secrets, and the mystical dimension. So these four rabbis, they're not failures. They're part of a methodology of moving from one state of consciousness to another, and going from pshat, the simple, the concrete, to sod, the mystical. And it's not that one of these methods is good or bad. It's that the pshat, the physical world, is the one that opens the door that allows you to travel and to shift your consciousness from taking things literally, to being analytical, to having it affect your behavior, to experiencing the universe all as one. So that's how I see the story. That's where the story takes me, as a lesson in shifts of consciousness, as opposed to one of them that only one rabbi is the one we should emulate, and that's Rabbi Akiva, who almost nobody can emulate anyway. But his achievements are not there for us to even try. But if we experience that mystical way, it's only because we actually investigated the physical world as well.
And this is a revelation on our part. The reason that our show is called Mystic and Skeptic is because one of my favorite authors or Jewish theologians is Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he wrote the Heavenly Torah, which talks about the mystical from Akiva and the skeptic or more rational from Rabbi Eliezer. And in the past 7 years, we've been exploring how you can look at spirituality and philosophy in an open way, but also be critical and try to find answers that are connected to, the sciences and the way we experience life in a methodological way versus just being completely free flow and nothing to hold on to. So there's a part in your book where Malka travels, and she goes to, I believe, Jerusalem, and she sees an image of the Virgin Mary with the baby, and reminds you of your mother. And then she keeps traveling through the Middle East. Is this also autobiographical of you going to Greece? And there's some stuff about or Iraq, and then being in Turkey with the dancers. Tell us a little bit about that.
The travels that Malka goes on are, you could actually chart them on a map. She starts with Paris, and it's Paris where she encounters the Madonnas all over the city, and everywhere she goes, the museums and the churches, and her first experience of churches as well. And then her travels, and the Madonna is a shock. The images of the Madonna and child are a shock for her. She's never seen anything like it. And I'm just realizing now, the books in her father's library don't have pictures anyway, have any pictures of anything. And there are certainly no books on the Madonna or on Christ. And she goes from there to Greece, to the islands. And so, yes, I would say, what a surprise. And her experiences in Spain, especially, there's a lot more in Spain than in the book than is immediately apparent. That is, there's an image of the Mezquita de Cordoba, the mosque cathedral of Cordoba, which is one of the most exquisite edifices imaginable from my point of view, because here you have this cathedral with a mosque inside of it and with another cathedral inside of that. And at the core of the cathedral, of the little cathedral in the center of this mosque, you see a pulpit, this enormous black pulpit, and below it is a bull. And the bull is being squashed, and the bull is in agony, being squashed by the pulpit of the church. And to me, that bull is the god El. And of course, the Spanish have a tradition of bullfighting, but they also have Altamira, the caves of Altamira, which is really a holy place for very ancient people who were painting these cave paintings of the bull representing something larger than themselves, and in the hopes of good hunts. And that bull becomes this holy relic from Spain all the way to India, going straight across, and treated in the Mezquita de Cordoba as this thing to be stamped out. And then the bullfights reinforce that. Her travels are where she encounters other cultures, and yet she in her own tradition has the word El, meaning God, and Elohim, meaning gods, the gods, and she sees this with her own eyes. She encounters the bull, for example, and then through archaeology, some of the other deities as well. So yes, I'm familiar with these travels, and Malka's travels are a few. She shares a few of them with me, but she hasn't gone anywhere that I haven't gone. So.
And this is the cover of the book that is in the middle of the narrative. Tell us about the feminist components in the book, because as an artist I can tell that that's Adam being created by God from Michelangelo, but it's with feminine figures, and the image of possibly the Shekinah, or God depicted as a female, has the written text behind her. Tell us if that's the inspiration for this image, and I know you work with the artist to create the illustrations.
Yes, that image shows Malka sitting on the Torah, or sitting near or in the sky there. That is, instead of God floating in the sky, you have a human being there with her glasses on. And that Torah is the Torah that the scroll that my father gave to me. It's 400 years old. My father founded a museum, and this scroll was too damaged to be in a museum, so he gave it to me to share with my students. And so everything even inside these images are coming from my house or my experience. And so Malka is at root exploring Bereshit, which is the passage that is in that image. And the goddess Anat is on the ground. So that is, she represents alchemical earth, and so there's this relationship between the Torah and the earth. So she represents the earth, and you have this connection between them. So yes, it's a parody, I suppose, of God and Adam linked together, which is very famous. And what we're doing is the feminine equivalent of that. Another way to look at it is Malka is the Shekhinah, perhaps, but or any mother and daughter. And then there are the Hebrew words me and ma. Me at the top, meaning who that is who creates, and then at the bottom ma, what. So it's the who and the what, and that is who is the creator and what is it that is created. So it has that dimension as well.
That's interesting. You have to have a very open mind if you're religious, because the thing that people bring up all the time is that instead of us being created in the image of God, is that we have created God in our own image. And that's why in all monotheistic traditions, he's male. As much as people try to say that, no, he wasn't really male, he has no gender. You know, with the little Hebrew that I know, everything is male-oriented and patriarchal. So to focus on the feminine of God, or to make God in a feminine image, is almost sacrilegious, because you're turning God into something that he didn't describe himself as. But there are some passages, especially stuff related to El Shaddai or wisdom or things like that within the whole of the Tanakh, that has some feminine components, but the majority of the descriptions are masculine. So then thinking of the other deities and how they were all fertility-based gods, that you can either look at it as that the Israelites or the Hebrews were fighting against those religious systems and trying to portray theirs as a singular God that had no partners and no concubines or wives or whatever. Or you can see it as they just focus on the masculine and they drop the feminine altogether as part of their specific claims. So to bring in the other gods as nature or as representing different elements or things like that, it's could be uncomfortable for religious folks. But even the part where it says that Baal becomes a brother, how do you see that? And I know that Anita Diamond in her book, The Red Tent, discusses that freely without any concern of offending anybody, that there was multiple deities and then they picked the ones they liked, and that became the narrative of the Tanakh. How do you see Baal and Asherah and all the different deities as you go along in your story?
I think it's a matter of evidence, not belief. And the evidence is that these ancient stories, these ancient deities, you can dig them up in the ground and find them in these ancient sites, and they were ubiquitous throughout the Mediterranean. I mean, people don't complain when you speak of the Greek gods and the stories of the Greek gods. We seem to teach that in school as part of Western civilization, and there's absolutely no reason to be afraid of these ancient deities. They're simply part of human history, and male and female student who, when I mentioned Baal in Jewish mysticism, she started crying and shaking. She was so upset that she had been taught that Baal was the devil, as opposed to a figurine that was found unearthed in a site in the Holy Land, and that this was an ancient god. And not only was it an ancient god, but there were many different kinds of Baal, and Baal is a Hebrew word, happens to mean husband, which I think is hysterical. And Baal Habayit is husband. It's there's nothing to be afraid of in these ancient figurines that we have found and are trying to figure out who they were, what did they do, why did humans need them, what were they for, what did people do with them, and that's why they were there. The Egyptian word was neter, which is where our word nature comes from. So these were depictions of natural elements in the world, trying to gain control over them, trying to get their help, get these features of the natural world to cooperate, and giving them names and giving them very human names, because we anthropomorphize. It's the way we deal with the unknown. So yes, I think people do get afraid. I mean, I wasn't raised that way. So it was the first time I encountered it, which was with this student crying in fear. I then discovered that many of my students were terrified of ancient concepts that were not part of their religious tradition. And I think that's what university, or that's what school is for, to encounter the history and prehistory of the world, as opposed to fearing it.
In later Hebrew, Baal became like master. So even the Baal Shem Tov is the master of the name, and it's a term used for Hasidic masters who created dynasties and are the leaders of the most religious groups. So it's interesting that the term itself is not offensive, but the association with a Canaanite deity. Tell us about Inanna. Is she connected to Lila or Lilith in any way, or is she more connected with the serpent?
Inanna and so Inanna, Ishtar, Ashtoret, Asherah, Astarte, Anat, and I'm leaving out Oset. If you think about these names, so these are the names of a female deity from Egypt to Sumer, across that area. That is regional names. Astarte, for example, was Phoenician name, and Oset was an Egyptian name. Asherah was the Hebrew name. If you look at these, I'm afraid I tend to look at them grammatically. And if you take the letters of their name, Semitic languages have a 3-letter root. There'll be 3, not necessarily consonants, but let's say consonants. And those 3 letters are the core of the meaning. And if you take all of those different goddesses, what you discover is they're basically the same one in different languages. And the word that at the core is the word woman. They're not like oh my God, there's this deity, there's this goddess, and there's that goddess. The idea is that there was a female goddess, and whatever the language was, that's her name is in that language. I don't see them as different. I mean, you can say, yes, there are stories of each of these goddesses, but the core of it is that it's deifying the feminine.
It's very interesting. My mentor wrote a book about Enoch, and in it he talks about the Watchers, or the Nephilim, and there's a correlation or a possible connection between them and the Titans of the Greek mythology. And then also in Babylon, with the story of, what was the name of that guy that he was kind of like Enoch that went up to the heavens with the gods? And I think it's the same guy that built an ark. So you see all this mythological beings and characters kind of borrowed or used to develop these stories. And the way that I see it, which is somewhere in the middle, is that it's common language. So if you're talking about, like you're saying, deifying the feminine, or worldwide flood, or fear of the divine, or whatever, they all use the similar creation stories and narratives to convey the same fears, the same worries, the same, like you're saying, trying to control nature, trying to make sense of the universe. And if you get caught up in the superstition and the cultic mentality of that time, stuff like that, it can become scary. And it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever seen the beginning of The Exorcism, where he finds a demon from the Babylonians, and then he brings it to the US, and then the demon comes out and goes inside of a little girl. So a lot of people who get too mystical or hyper focused on that, they start almost like falling into these paranoia related to these deities that, in my eyes, they were the expression of that time of trying to make sense of their surroundings. And then later they became demonic, as you see in the Talmud and in the New Testament, where, you know, like they call Jesus Beelzebub. And if you know religious anthropology, it was the cult of Baal at that time and the way that they worshiped him. And they were pretty much saying that he was an agent of that deity, but then later it became that he was working with the devil or whatever, because he was casting out demons. So, but going back to your book, when we look at the poetry, tell us what kind of poetic systems do you use? I'm not very familiar with poetry myself, but as an artist, I appreciate the way that people convey ideas. So at the end of the book and the epilogue, you have a very nice narrative where it says, "It's the day before creation. I open my unborn eyes and yawn. There is only light inside this darkness. I stretch and give a little kick. Nestled within my mother, I am warm and safe and whole. Nothing is broken. This surely is Bereshit Bara. This is how my life begins. This time round, I'll ask my mother all my questions on the Torah. First Hagar, Abraham and Sarah, Ishmael and Kenahorah, Akedah and Lecha. What does it mean when we say the Shema? But first, a door opens, come and see." So you pretty much, all of Judaism is in a few lines. What kind of poetic, how would you call that in poetry, and how do you are able to bring in so much depth into a small section of your poetry?
I have no idea how you would call it in the realm of poetry. I see poetry as being about breath, and actually the reason the lines are the way they are is that they represent how I breathe. If I'm reading out loud, so that last part, and the last part that you read, this time round I'll ask my mother. So this entire book is rooted in the teachings of my father and dealing with that. But if I were to write the book again, if I started all over again, in this kind of gilgulim, this a reincarnation, and the ability to start again, instead of asking my father, I would ask my mother. And my questions about the Bible actually are these last ones on the very last page of the book. This time round, I'll ask my mother all my questions on the Torah. First, Hagar, Avram, and Sarah, Akedah, and Ishmael and Kenahorah, Akedah and Lech Lecha. What does it mean when we say the Shema? These actually, apart from the et, these have concerned me. They're not just there because they rhyme, I suppose, but they really are the heart of what I care about in the Torah. That is, Abraham as the root of it all, and the I'm going to call it the problem of Ishmael in the Bible, compared to the relationship of Avram or Ibrahim and Ismail in the Quran. I mean, I think the section called Lech Lecha which is the first story of Abraham in the Bible, that brings us to so many contemporary issues today, land issues, and the differences between Muslims and Jews, and the difference between Arab attachment to the land and Jewish attachment to the land, and the relationship between Avram and Hagar and Avram and Sarah, his wife. I'm extremely interested in exploring those. They're on the very last page of the book, meaning that's another place to start. There's always another place to start.
And I wasn't familiar with the term Keinahora, which is something that is very, it's amazing how far the evil eye tradition has gone. Growing up in Mexico, we were healed with an egg whenever we got sick, and then found out that it was a Moroccan tradition. I always thought that was indigenous to do that. And then I found out about the evil eye and the blue eye that Greeks and other Middle Eastern Mediterranean people wear. And then I even found some traces of it in the Torah itself, in the story of Joseph. So it's amazing that tradition in Israel is very popular to carry a little keychain with an eye and a blessing. What about that is intriguing to you?
The first time my mother told me she loved me was when she was handing me an amulet, her favorite amulet that she received from her mother when I was going off to Iraq. And so she was giving me this protection, this blessing, and this statement that she had never actually voiced in my entire life before, at least not to me. And her love was tied up in the protection of amulets. And so I wore this throughout Iraq. This was under Saddam. Okay, so actually, I suppose the amulet worked, because after we got detained, we did not come to harm, because, well, it's a long story, but I see the amulets work. You know, I grew up with the idea that amulets are the key to a good life and protection. My grandfather told me the story many times of when he was a kid, he had asthma. And so he went to the rabbi and he asked the rabbi for an amulet to protect him from the asthma, his breathing problems. And the rabbi wrote an amulet and he wore the amulet, and it didn't help. It didn't help his asthma. So he went to the priest and he said, please give me an amulet for my asthma. And the priest wrote him an amulet. It's lovely that it crosses these traditions. And he wore the amulet and it didn't help. And so my grandfather went to the imam. He was living in a little town at the edge of Turkey. It's in Macedonia, called Monastir, which is now called Bitula. So it was under the Ottoman Empire. And so the imam wrote him an amulet, and he wore the amulet, and he got better. And so he said that the imam's amulets were more powerful. I'm sure they all wrote the same thing, but well, actually, I have no idea. But he always told me the story that he was protected by the imam, which was also the story, since my family's Sephardic and were expelled from Spain and ended up under the invited by the Ottoman Empire. His personal story of being protected by the amulet of the Imam was the story of the people, of our people, the Sephardim, being protected by the Ottomans when they arrived under their jurisdiction. So he told me this, that we're being protected. And the amulets, the way I would put it, are a symbol of that protection.
Well, we're fascinated with your journey and you finding a creative way to put it on writing and illustrated by Mr. Josh Baum. How did you guys connect, and being represented by a publisher, has that helped get your message across? And what are your plans with the book and the movie as things develop?
The movie is in the process of going to film festivals. It's won a bunch of awards. It's about to be shown in on the 28th, I believe, 28th of April in New York City at on West 86th Street, and which will be the first time. It won't, because of COVID, it's been streamed, so it's going to be on the silver screen. So it's still making its journey around the world. It was first shown in Italy and then in Istanbul. I mean, it really is traveling around. The book, Malka's Notebook, just came out, and so it's just at the very beginning of its journey. And I'm hoping that the book and the movie, that the movie can accompany the book on its journey, which I hope will also be as worldwide as the movie has been.
And so how are you still creating? What are your plans after this project?
If you look at Malka's Notebook, you can see there's a lot of blank space on the left-hand side of the page. And all of that space is actually filled with writing. And there is another tale that is not told in this version because my publisher felt it was a different book. And what there is on that left-hand side in small print are the differences between Malka's story and my story. And that's the next adventure, I suppose, is to enter into those blank spaces in this book and to fill them in.
Wonderful. Well, we want to thank you for your time, and we hope you become a friend of the show and come and share with you your ongoing journey and the way that you're using art to process your experience. We would like to know more about your father and your mother's life stories growing up in different parts of the world, and how that came together in your life and growing up in San Francisco and having these experiences with your students. But for now, we appreciate learning about your projects and your wisdom and the many facets of Judaism and ancient religions and world traditions that you have shared on the show.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.